How's it going, everyone? In today's video, I am going to be discussing blood vessels, and I hope for this video to actually be a pretty short one because I'm just going to introduce the different types of blood vessels and some characteristics about them. But in the next video, we'll be more so discussing hemodynamics, and that is going to cover blood flow, and we're going to discuss how blood flow is manipulated throughout the body and how blood pressure is, going to change in certain situations and what impact that has for us. So again, this video hopefully pretty short, just introducing all the different types of blood vessels and a little bit about the lymphatic system. And then the next video we'll talk more so about those hemodynamics, about blood pressure, and about blood flow. There are 5 different types of blood vessels. We have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and then veins. And so on the arterial side of the circulation, we are going to be carrying oxygenated blood, arterial blood. So the heart is going to pump out this oxygenated blood and is going to go through this big artery right here called the aorta, and then from the aorta, all that blood that's pumped out from the heart is going to be distributed throughout the body through these arteries and head away from the heart towards cells and different tissues of our bodies. And so that blood will carry oxygen and nutrients to all these different cells, and so your blood vessels sort of work like roadways. And so you could consider this like a big interstate heading to your target destination. And as you get off the exit and you have, you get a little bit more specific and a little bit more focused with the delivery of that blood, it's going to be distributed to these smaller arteries called arterioles. And you'll see that as we head towards the tissue, these pathways will get smaller and smaller till we get to the local circulation. And so the blood vessels where nutrient exchange, gas exchange actually takes place between the blood and the cells, that is going to happen at the place called the capillaries. And so we talked about capillaries a little bit. So again, cells are going to pick up things like oxygen and glucose and fatty acids, and then dump off things like CO2 and different waste products. And then once that exchange occurs, the blood, now with less oxygen and more CO2, is going to start to head back to the heart in order to be reoxygenated and start all over again. So that blood, again, travels from the capillaries to venules, smaller veins carrying this deoxygenated blood, and then to bigger and bigger veins, eventually heading back into the vena cava, either inferior or superior, which are going to dump all that deoxygenated blood into the right atrium. And then the heart can pump that to the lungs to get reoxygenated, and the whole cycle starts again. We could see that blood vessels are made up of different groups of cells which are going to have their own function within the blood vessel. And so each cell is going to have an endothelium, which basically lines the inside of the vessel and where blood actually makes contact and moves through our vasculature. And this endothelium contains cells which can actually signal to the circulation into the vessels as a whole. And so when blood is flowing through here, it could send out signals to the smooth muscle to dilate if there is an increase in blood flow. And so these are active cells, and they don't just, serve as a place where blood actually makes contact and passes through. It is actually going to interact with the other cells of the vessel in order to make changes in our blood flow. We could also see that smooth muscles will surround the lumen or the blood vessel inside, and the purpose of the smooth muscle is to either constrict the vessel, and that is going to be called vasoconstriction. And when you do that, you're restricting blood flow to wherever you are delivering it. Or you can do what's called vasodilation, where smooth muscles relax, the size of the vessel becomes bigger, and that's going to help increase blood flow to wherever it's going. And so, smooth muscles are going to play a huge role in our blood flow. On the arterial side, you could see the density or the cross-sectional area, significantly greater on the arterial side than it is on the venous side, because we're going to have to use those smooth muscles in order to deliver blood, more blood or less blood to different areas of the body. And then we also have connective tissue, which is going to give other qualities to blood vessels. Elastic connective tissue, of course, is going to provide elasticity. So whenever vessels expand, they are able to take on quantities of blood, and it's going to help, when that elastic tissue sort of snaps back, it's going to help with that blood flow. And then we have fibrous connective tissue, which surrounds these vessels and helps with protection. And here you could see, a good example of how that elasticity adds to pressure and blood flow. So whenever the left ventricle pumps out blood, what's going to happen is, it's all going to go into this aorta here. And since, it has a little bit of elasticity, that it's able to take on quantities of blood, without stressing the vessel so much that it's going to get damaged. So it's able to take on that blood, and then when it snaps back there like a rubber band, that pressure is going to help drive blood flow forward towards the capillaries and towards the different cells of the body. So once blood leaves the heart, heads to the aorta, heads down all these arteries towards its section of the body where it's delivering blood, that blood's going to go into smaller vessels called arterioles, and those arterioles will eventually deliver oxygenated blood to capillaries, where those nutrients and waste products and gases are all exchanged. Arterioles are known as resistance vessels because when we are going to change blood flow in our body, when we are going to change blood pressure in our bodies, these vessels are going to be the most responsible for those changes in blood pressure and blood flow. And so when vasoconstriction occurs, what's going to happen is that it's going to increase resistance. And resistance just opposes blood flow. So, thinking about it just from the sense of this vessel, right? If you decrease the size, if you vasoconstrict, that's less space for blood to flow through. So you're building up resistance to that blood flow. So vasoconstriction caused by smooth muscles are going to lead to higher resistances or increased resistances, which raises blood pressure but decreases blood flow in that arteriole. And vasodilation will do the opposite. If I'm expanding the area where that blood can flow, well, then that's going to decrease resistance to blood flow and thus decrease blood pressure. Capillaries are going to be the site of nutrient exchange, gas exchange, and waste exchange. And you can see that making up the capillaries are just the single layer of endothelium and the basement membrane. And the reason why they look so different than the venous side of the circulation and the arterial side of the circulation is because their main function is just to exchange all these materials between the vasculature and the cells of the body. There are going to be different types of capillaries, which we'll break down here in a second, which will allow for different types of objects to be permeable to capillaries, with bigger pores or fenestrations to allow bigger materials to be transported in and out of the vasculature. And we're going to see that the capillaries are going to just, surround all these different tissues of the body. And, we're going to have different mechanisms in order to control the blood flow towards certain cells. The arterial blood is going to come through these arterioles and make its way down to the microcirculation. And so you can imagine here, there will be multiple cells that are taking part in gas exchange and nutrient exchange. And so that blood is going to travel down this microcirculation. All those materials are picked up, some are dumped off, and then it makes its way back to the venule and the venous side of the circulation, which carries that blood flow back to the heart. But we could see within that circulation, that microcirculation, that there are these sphincters which control blood flow at the microcirculation level. And so if one of these sphincters contracts, it's then going to cut off blood flow in a certain direction. And then all that blood flow is going to travel down this medarteriole instead to make its way down to these specific cells. And so again, there's communication going on in the vasculature. The endothelial cells of the capillaries, the smooth muscle cells will release certain things, and all of that sort of cellular level communications probably, better explained in upper level classes, because you don't really need to know the details just yet of all of that. But again, there are just signals and mechanisms in order to manipulate the flow of blood. And that happens not only at the bigger level in the arterioles, changing their size, but also at the microcirculation. We have 3 different types of capillaries, so let's talk about the differences between them. Continuous capillaries are a single layer of tissue here in the endothelium. They do have a basement membrane surrounding that endothelial tissue, but you can see that no really big pores are, present within this type of capillary. It's able to exchange only certain materials through here, smaller materials, because there's not those huge holes or pores within this capillary. So things like water, small solutes, glucose are able to move through here, and this type of capillary is the most abundant within our bodies. In fenestrated capillaries, you're going to see a little bit bigger pores that are then found in continuous capillaries, and so this is going to allow for higher permeability, and so areas of the body that do that have a huge role in uptake of certain materials or secretion of certain materials, especially the kidneys, small intestines, endocrine organs, things that dump off hormones. You're going to see more of these types of capillaries located there. Sinusoids are going to have very large fenestrations and very large pores to allow for, a lot bigger materials to actually be transported between the body and the bloodstream. So, it's permeable to bigger sized things like proteins and even cells. And so a lot of places of the body that have to do with either production of cells or recycling of certain materials throughout the body, such as the bone marrow, the spleen, the liver, you're going to see a lot more of these types of capillaries in these locations. Blood is going to flow from the heart to the arterial circulation, to the capillaries, and that blood flow is going to drive many materials throughout the bloodstream. And once we get to the capillaries, certain of those materials, including gases, nutrients, and fluids, are, then taken into the interstitial space, the space in between cells, and then eventually uptaken by the cells. Certain things need to be transported by transocytosis, meaning that, again, we're going to not allow all materials just to cross the bilayers of different cells. Things like protein hormones may require a vesicle in order to be filtered from the bloodstream into the interstitial space. But a lot of materials are going to move through. And whenever we have a material going from the bloodstream or from the capillary into that interstitial fluid, that's called filtration. And whenever we have materials being going from the interstitial space or the cells from the capillaries, that's called absorption. And what is going to drive that filtration and what's going to drive that absorption? That's going to be the certain forces of the blood and the materials in the blood called starling forces. The pressure that is generated from the fluid within the capillary and the fluid within the interstitial space is called hydrostatic pressure. So both of these fluids, both, again, the blood and the interstitial fluid, have pressure that opposes each other. And the actual materials within those fluids, within the blood and within the interstitial space, things like proteins, they're going to generate a pressure as well. And so net filtration pressure is basically how you measure the differences between the actual inside of the capillary, the plasma colloid osmotic pressure, and then the capillary hydrostatic pressure. So when those two pressures are higher than the outside, that drives filtration. But when the the pressures in the interstitial fluid are higher, the hydrostatic pressure and the colloid pressure within that fluid, if those pressures are higher, that's going to drive absorption. And so again, movement of materials, movement of fluids is going to depend upon these pressures, and the same for filtering and absorption. If that pressure on the inside of the capillary is higher than the pressure on the outside, that will drive filtration from the bloodstream to the cells. But if the pressure on the interstitial fluid is higher than what's inside that capillary, that's going to drive absorption. The venous circulation is going to be responsible for carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. And so from capillaries, all that deoxygenated blood is going to travel first into the venules, smaller, more microscopic veins that eventually will dump into bigger veins. And that, is where we're going to then carry that blood back to the heart. And these veins have a key feature, which are these valves, which are going to help prohibit the backflow of blood. And then we'll discuss the different types of venous pumps and how that helps aid blood flow back to the heart. Here we could see two different types of venous pump, which are going to help to increase preload back to the heart. And we know that this is important because, again, the more blood we are able to deliver back to the heart, the more blood that will then fill the ventricles, a higher preload, which then causes a higher stroke volume, and a higher stroke volume causes a higher cardiac output. So I mentioned during exercise that this pump here, the skeletal muscle pump, is going to help drive blood flow back to the heart. And how does that work? Well, when these muscles contract, it's going to, squeeze this vein and basically build up pressure here. And that buildup of pressure is going to help drive blood flow back to the heart, because at the right atrium, we have very low pressures. And since we're building up pressure here in the veins, that blood flow is going to go from a place of high pressure to low pressure. So this is helping to drive blood flow and drive preload and increase preload to the heart to help increase stroke volume and cardiac output. And a main reason why, blood doesn't go back in the other direction is because these valves. And once the muscle pump occurs and that vein is basically squeezed in order to drive that blood back to the heart, these valves are going to close and they're going to prohibit the backflow of blood, and it's going to drop pressures on the inside. And then when more blood comes along through the circulation, it's going to fill back up. And as those contractions occur, the same thing will happen. And so that, again, that skeletal muscle pump, very important for driving preload and helping keep stroke volume high and cardiac output high during exercise. On the right, we also have the respiratory pump. And again, it's very important, and maybe it would have been smart to talk about pressures and flows first, but liquids and gases flow, again, from areas of high pressure to low pressure. And so what we ultimately want is the most blood coming back to the right atrium. And so this pressure here is 0. And so if we're able to manipulate pressures throughout the body, that's how we're going to help drive blood flow. And so when we breathe, and we'll discuss this more when we get to the respiratory system and the pulmonary system, when we breathe, it's going to change pressures inside our thoracic cavity. And when we breathe in, the volume of our thoracic cavity expands and lowers pressures within. So this actually helps. By lowering the pressure, it's going to help drive blood flow back to the heart. So both of these, skeletal muscle pump and the respiratory pump, help to increase preload and help to drive venous blood, deoxygenated blood, back to the right atrium. The venous side of our circulation is compliant, meaning that it can hold on to large quantities of blood without high pressures. And again, we'll discuss more of this in the next video, but a note just on the venous side, since it's able to hold as large quantities of blood, it serves as a blood reservoir. And we're going to see that 2/3 of our blood are going to be within the venous side of the circulation, which is a lot more than the other areas of the body. And so again, the reason for this is because the venous circulation, the venules and veins are very compliant and hold on to large quantities of blood. To conclude this lecture, I will discuss the lymphatic system. And the reason we group it in together with the blood vessels and the blood circulation is because you could see that it runs basically parallel or alongside our blood vessels. And it's going to have many different functions throughout the body. And, as you could see, it's a vast network of vessels, and that fluid inside is referred to as lymph. And so it picks up the excess fluid that is filtered out by the capillaries. So you could see that these lymphatic vessels run alongside our veins and our arteries, and that, in that interstitial fluid, some of that fluid and some of those materials get uptaken by the lymphatic vessels to be circulated throughout the body. And so not only is interstitial fluid uptaken here, but some of the proteins that can be returned back to the blood. There are dietary lipids that are carried throughout the lymphatic system. And another thing is that it's going to play a role in our immune response. And the thing is that these vessels make their way to, immune organs such as the spleen, the appendix, where there are high concentrations of immune cells. And so, these immune cells can help eliminate certain microbes and certain bacteria in our bodies. So again, this lymphatic system, it serves many roles. It, helps drain out certain fluids. It helps process certain proteins and materials that were dumped off from the bloodstream. It plays a role in the immune response, and then also it helps carry dietary lipids as well. That will conclude our lecture on blood vessels. And in the next video, we'll be discussing the actual pressure that the blood exerts on these vessels, and that's called blood pressure. I know I alluded to it a little bit today, but we'll talk about how blood pressure is calculated and the role that blood pressure is going to basically have as far as our blood flow and our health and the delivery of oxygen is concerned. And so, again, I wanted to make this a little bit shorter of a lecture. It did wind up going a little bit longer than I expected, but it's important to note those differences. And just in the next one, we'll really talk more so about blood flow and what things are manipulated in order to deliver more blood to a certain area of the body or less blood to a certain area of the body. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next lecture.